In the sweltering heat of 1969, the world saw the counterculture movement at its peak.
I am he, as you are he, and you are me, and we are all together.
A kaleidoscope of rebellion, liberation, and change. But beneath the surface of the peace and love ethos lay darker undercurrents: disillusionment, alienation, and violence. For every idealistic hippie seeking enlightenment, there were others where the counterculture's promises of freedom twisted into nightmares. The Manson family, led by the enigmatic and manipulative Charles Manson, stands as the most infamous of these cautionary tales. While the spotlight often shines on the young women who were drawn into Manson's orbit, the shadowy roles of the young men in the group are equally chilling, yet often overlooked. These men were not the flower-wielding pacifists often associated with the 1960s. Many of them were troubled individuals carrying heavy burdens from their pasts. In 1969, America was deeply scarred by the Vietnam War, its youth caught between loyalty to their country and a growing disdain for its institutions. Among the Manson family were men who had faced combat or military life and returned not as heroes, but as ghosts of themselves. Many of the young men who found themselves disillusioned and adrift in the 1960s had grown up idolizing the fathers and uncles who had nobly served their country during World War II. Those men, hailed as the greatest generation, had returned home as heroes, welcomed with parades and celebrations after defeating the evils of fascism, the Nazi scourge, and the cataclysmic war in the Pacific. Their sacrifices were honored, their contributions immortalized in history books, and their service became a beacon of patriotic pride. It was under these towering shadows that the sons of the 1960s were raised, believing that military service was not only a duty but a path to honor and respect. When the call to arms came for Vietnam, many eagerly signed up or went willingly when drafted, expecting to follow in their fathers' footsteps and achieve something equally heroic. Instead, they encountered the stark and brutal reality of a war that seemed unwinnable, morally ambiguous, and deeply unpopular. Upon their return, they were not met with ticker-tape parades or gratitude, but with disdain, rejection, and even outright hostility. They were spat on, called baby killers, and treated as outcasts. This betrayal by the very society they had believed they were defending turned many of these young men against the establishment, their communities, and even their own families, leaving them vulnerable to charismatic figures like Charles Manson. And some, disillusioned by the horrors of war or the rigid expectations of service, had gone AWOL, rejecting the very system they once served. They drifted into the fringes of society, their instability making them ripe for addiction, mental illness, and crime. Other young men, while they never served in the military, carried their own scars and secrets, troubled upbringings, run-ins with the law, or a deep-seated resentment for authority. These were men like Charles Tex Watson, a seemingly clean-cut boy from Texas, who became one of Manson's most loyal enforcers. Bruce Davis, a Southern student adrift after being questioned falsely by police, turned to the Manson family, who validated his existence, and Bobby Beausoleil, a musician turned criminal with a penchant for rebellion. They were volatile, impressionable, and searching for meaning in an era that promised them none. For men like these, Manson's doctrine of anti-establishment rhetoric and promised power was irresistible. He offered them a brotherhood, an identity, and a purpose. What Manson truly provided, however, was a stage for their violent impulses and a narrative that justified their darkest instincts. Charles Manson himself was the catalyst for this transformation. At 34, he was older than most of his followers and carried the hardened experience of a lifetime spent in and out of prison. To these young men, he embodied the ultimate anti-hero, someone who had rejected societal norms and carved his own path, however destructive. Charlie's ability to read people and exploit their weaknesses turned these troubled young men into instruments of his will. He didn't need to lead with direct violence. Instead, he planted seeds of chaos and revolution, letting his followers carry out his vision. The Manson family's male members saw in Manson not just a leader, but a surrogate father in an era when many of them had grown up without stable paternal figures. He became a mirror of their rage and resentment, amplifying their anger and channeling it into acts of brutality. The allure of communal life, a supposed rejection of societal norms, was for these men a promise of freedom from responsibility and accountability. And in the patriarchal structure of the family, they were elevated, given roles of dominance, and surrounded by women who were expected to serve and adore them. Manson's philosophy was rooted in violence, misogyny, and a nihilistic vision of the future. And these men were ready to embrace it. In this video, part of our What Became of the Manson Family series, we'll be exploring 4 of these young men. They aren't well known, but they are emblematic of the young men who gravitated toward Charlie, particularly in mid-1969, during the summer that turned so dark and bloody. For these lost boys, as they might be called, the family wasn't just a home, it was a battlefield where they could act out their frustrations with the world. They weren't hippies singing songs of love and peace. They were disillusioned, angry, and often dangerous. Some had grown up steeped in violence and criminality. Others had been warped by the trauma of war or a lifetime of neglect. The family provided them with a dark purpose, an outlet for their aggression, and a leader who encouraged their worst tendencies. In the late spring of 1969, we believe, Lawrence Giddings started to hang around at the Spawn Ranch, eventually working as a ranch hand. He was 16 years old, but likely lied about his age to be hired. Born in Germany on October 6, 1952, he was a military brat who got revolutionized at a very tender age. In his own words, "My journey began as a rebel, pure and simple, against family, against school, against adults, against most anything that got in my way of achieving some personal enjoyment and development in life. I left home, left school, and dropped into the world at large to find all the impediments multiplied. Firstly, I recognized ageism as a repressive cultural force. Secondly, I left the family, as an incubator of the state was the most repressive institution. Thirdly, the state, the enforcer of economic disparity and manager of all other institutions, the inhibitor of change, was the target of my rebellion. Within the structure of the state, I swiftly recognized the police and criminal justice system as the immediate arm of state authority. I was very clear on this when I was 14, 15, 16 years old. I had read lots of history, been active in street actions in Germany, and preparing for armed action in the U.S. from 16 to 17 years of age. There was no doubt in my mind that armed revolution was needed to effect any real change in this system. I had learned all too well, as the son of a career Army sergeant, that force was the only thing that the state understood. Living near Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and Annapolis, I witnessed, all too often, the results of peace demonstrations and sit-ins and civil rights marches, not to mention anti-war demos. Discussion was out of the question. I wasn't willing to lay down and let the state, or anyone else, beat me bloody, attack me with its dogs, and shoot me without fighting back. My less than perfectly executed expropriation of arms to pass out to liberated prisoners and a good number of 16 to 18-year-olds, much like myself, in L.A. in 1971, landed me in prison for 7 years. Larry is referring there to his 1971 participation in armed robbery, the goals of which were to potentially break Charles Manson out of prison following his conviction for the Tate LaBianca murders and death sentence. But let's back up a few steps to 1969. Charlie is known to have distrusted Larry, who used the name Larry Bailey and was nicknamed Little Larry, allegedly because he suspected that the teen was of mixed race. There aren't a lot of details about Larry and his actions that summer up until the night of Friday, August 8th, when he loaned Linda Kasabian a knife. That was the night that Linda and 3 others drove to Cielo Drive with the intention of killing the occupants. Linda did not murder anyone, but she did loan that knife to either Pat Krenwinkle or Susan Atkins. Reports vary. 5 people were murdered that night, and 2 more the following night. 1 week later, a multi-agency law enforcement raid commenced at dawn at Spawn Ranch, initiated by reports of stolen vehicles several months before. By the time the raid began, police knew that Spawn Ranch was also harboring underage runaways, dealing in drugs and stolen credit cards, and other crimes. They also were aware that an associate of the family, Bobby Beausoleil, had been arrested a week and a half before on suspicion of murder. Charles Manson, his family, several ranch hands, and various others, including a few straight Satans, the Outlaw Motorcycle Club, were arrested on August 16th, but released 2 days later on a possible administrative error. Larry gave the name Larry Jones during his arrest. All of the children were taken into protective services and not immediately released. Days later, Charlie was arrested again on suspicion of using marijuana. It was actually a hand-rolled tobacco cigarette he was found smoking, by more police showing up to Spawn Ranch. Police didn't seem to know anything about the murders a week before in Los Angeles, yet they appeared to be surveilling the ranch in hopes of catching Manson and/or the family in illegal activity. Charlie believed that ranch hand Donald Shea, known as Shorty, was snitching to police. This was actually a likely scenario, as Shea was overheard speaking to a man named Frank Retz, a neighbor of ranch owner George Spahn, someone interested in buying all or part of the adjacent property. Shea agreed to help Retz oust the family from the Chatsworth Ranch. Shea had also come under Charlie's ire for various other reasons, and the family believed that Shea was responsible for their children and a host of potentially valuable possessions being confiscated during the August 16th raid. On August 26th, Charlie directed several people to kill Shorty. It was only in recent years that we learned, during parole hearings, that Larry Giddings was one of those men. Initially, Shea was assaulted by Charles Tex Watson, Steve Clem Grogan, and Bruce Davis near the ranch. Then, a second vehicle pulled up with Charles Manson, Bill Van Sickle, and Giddings. Tex was the first to attack, stabbing Shea with a knife. Shea had been driving a vehicle with Watson, Grogan, and Davis, and after pulling over, Shea, at the wheel of the car, was stabbed once by Watson and then struck in the head with a wrench by Grogan. It was at this point that the second vehicle arrived, and Davis cut Shea across the collarbone and shoulder. We do not know for certain that Charlie, Van Sickle, or Giddings actively participated in the killing of Shea, or simply witnessed it, but it appears likely that Davis, Grogan, and Watson were not the only killers. According to Davis at his 2007 parole hearing, I look around and there's Bill Vance, Tex Watson, Steve Grogan, with bloody knives, and they'd been through this. And Manson is alleged to have told his co-author Newell Emmons, printed in 1986's Manson in My Own Words, the DA, referring to prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi, caught up in his theory of helter-skelter and obsessed with making the world believe I was a satanic Pied Piper, overlooked many participants, accessories, and conspirators. Someplace out there in that society he protects so well, he has left several killers to prowl the streets. This seems to indicate more than one potential active participant in Shay's murder, which would indicate that perhaps both Van Sickle and Giddings did help kill the ranch hand. After Shay's murder, Charlie and the family left Spawn Ranch for Death Valley. There, in early October, another raid commenced, this time initially triggered by arson, after the family torched a large earth mover belonging to the National Park Service. During this raid, Larry gave his true name of Giddings. While not photographed with the family during late 1969 and the grand jury indictments, or into 1970 and the first trials associated with the murders, Giddings apparently was keeping a close eye on things. He was living at the home of Lee Sawnook, a.k.a. Wendy Buckley, a woman who had been in a relationship with a stuntman who periodically lived at Spawn Ranch in Canoga Park. Lee had allowed Spawn Ranch hands Juan Flynn and Johnny Swartz to stay with her, and when Larry, also employed at the ranch that season, told them he was scared of the family, he was permitted to stay with Lee as well. Swartz and Flynn were each scheduled to testify against Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten during their 1970 trial for the Tate and LaBianca murders. Eventually, Juan figured out that Larry was a Manson family plant, there to find out what the men intended to testify to, and possibly to help aid and abet an attempt to kill the two witnesses. Rumor has it that when Flynn and Sawnook found out about little Larry's duplicity, they stripped him naked and tied him to a tree near Spawn Ranch. Giddings didn't return to Lee's home, but he was still part of the family. In August 1971, he was one of the participants in the shootout at an Army-Navy surplus store in Hawthorne, California. Kenneth Como, the alleged ringleader, a member of the Aryan Brotherhood, and an inmate at San Quentin who busted out during transport to Los Angeles, who took over leadership of Manson's family in the wake of his incarceration, led Dennis Rice, Catherine Gypsy Scherer, Mary Brunner, Chuck Lovett, and Little Larry to Hawthorne. There they held up staff and customers at gunpoint and gathered more than 140 rifles to be used, ostensibly, to break Manson out of prison. But someone tripped a silent alarm, bringing police to the scene. A shootout began, and when it was over, Larry, Mary, and Gypsy were wounded, and everyone was arrested with the exception of 19-year-old Lovett, who managed to flee undetected for a few days. The robbers planned to steal the rifles, use them to break Manson out of jail, then hijack a plane to fly him out of the country. They also robbed a store in Covina a week earlier, making off with $2,600 in cash. Como, Giddings, Mary, and Gypsy all pled not guilty by reason of insanity to their charges for the Hawthorne robbery and shootout. The insanity plea didn't stick for any of the four, and they were convicted for the Hawthorne shootout and the Covina robbery. Larry was sentenced to 20 years in prison, where initially he aligned himself with the Aryan Nation. Then he began to educate himself, finding radical inspiration in everything from feminist advocacy to the American Indian movement. 7 years after his conviction, a parole board showed mercy on the first-time felon, and he was released. But months later, in October 1979, Giddings and a POW friend attempted to free another comrade from a Washington state jail, robbing a bank to finance their efforts. Their attempt resulted in the shooting and wounding of a police officer. Giddings was convicted of armed robbery, bank expropriations, and conspiracy, and sentenced to 75 years consecutively. Larry, who refers to himself as an eclectic anarchist, considers himself today a political prisoner with no hope of parole.
Because if they can do it to them, they can do it to you. And the harder you make it for it to do it to them, the better it'll be for you.
We discussed Vern a bit in the most recent video in this series, The Last Girls, in conjunction with his relationship with Diane Von On. Let's learn a bit more about Vern. We believe that Vern showed up at Spawn Ranch around the same time as Linda Kasabian in early July 1969. He was AWOL from the Marines, and Ruby Pearl Molinaro hired him as a ranch hand. Born in Corvallis, Oregon, Vernon Ray Dean Plumley supplemented his paltry earnings from the ranch by robbing and stealing during the summer of '69 with Bill Van Sickle. He later spoke on a few occasions about his experiences with Manson and the family, giving us some perspective of his time with them. When I first met Charlie, he walked up and said, "Let me run your life down," and he did. It just kind of blew my mind. He said I had been in jail since I was 14, knew I was at McLaren Hall, knew I was AWOL. I don't know how he knew. Ed Saunders wrote, Vern Plumley has told of the large amounts of cash the family sometimes obtained. They had $30,000, and they went down and bought all kinds of sitars, guitars, drums. Everybody dropped some acid, got loaded. At the end of the acid trip, there wasn't an instrument that was playable. Saunders also alleged that in July 1969, Plumley creepy crawled the homes of singer Jack Jones, who lived on Cielo Drive, and actor Marvin Miller a month before the Tate LaBianca murders using a sawed-off shotgun. Vern is next interjected into the story on Friday, August 8th, hours ahead of the murders at Cielo Drive. Mary Bruner and Sandra Good had been sent to go shopping, and while at a Sears store in San Fernando Valley, Mary used a stolen credit card belonging to one Mary Vitasek, the sister-in-law of Vern Plumley. Vern must have donated the card to the family till, not realizing that Mary V had reported it missing. When Mary B tried to pay for her items at Sears with the card, the clerk noted that the two women were acting strangely, looked up her master list of reported stolen cards, and flagged the store manager, who took off after the thieves. Sandra and Mary were able to flee via their vehicle, a Hostess bread van the family used, but were nabbed shortly after by police. It was the late-night call from one of these women to Spawn Ranch that may have triggered Charles Manson to order the killings at Cielo. Plumley later told a journalist that he saw Tex and the women leave Spawn Ranch that night and knew what they were up to. A couple days later, some of the women discussed convincing Vern's sister-in-law to talk her out of pressing charges against Mary to avoid having to raise $850 bail money for Bruner. That discussion went nowhere. During the August 16th raid at the ranch, a week after the murders, Vern gave the name Vern Edward Thompson. Sometime after August 16th, but before August 26th, Bill Van Sickle, a.k.a. Vance, a.k.a. William Rex Cole, returned to Spawn's after departing nearly a month before. During August, Bill and Vern were on a crime spree. At some point, two new young men at the ranch, Kenneth Brown and John Haught, joined them. Kenneth Richard Brown, a.k.a. Scotty Davis, and John Phillip Zero Haught arrived at the ranch in August after the raid. Zero had been a seaman apprentice in the Navy and possibly involved with the Straight Satans. They were good mechanics, both originally from Ohio, who helped the family convert VW bugs into dune buggies. Later, some of the dune buggies were sold for cash. Van Sickle, Plumley, and Zero were driving around San Fernando Valley that August, holding up gas stations. They used Lee Saunick's pickup truck without her permission. She was pulled over by police after an APB was issued on the vehicle, and thankfully proved she was at work during commission of the crimes. But when she realized what happened, she tore into Bill. Van Sickle said something to Manson, who showed up at Saunick's house and punched her so hard that he broke her jaw. She had a gun in her hand at the time and tried to shoot him, but it failed to go off. Lee was in the hospital for several days and visited there by Shorty Shea. With her jaw wired shut and a face purple with bruises, She was unable to explain what happened, but her roommate told Shorty what Charlie did. Sawnook believed this contributed to the ranch hand's brutal murder just a few days later. We know that Bill Van Sickle was present at the murder of Shorty Shea on August 26th. Immediately after the murder, Bill and Vern drove to Portland, Oregon, bringing a woman named Diane Von On back with them. After that, Van Sickle, Plumlee, Von On, and a man known as Ed Bailey, possibly Larry Bailey, true name Lawrence Giddings, rented a house in Burbank. During the October 1969 raid in Death Valley, Vern again used the name Vern Edward Thompson upon arrest. When Zero died in Venice Beach a month later under suspicious circumstances, but allegedly of a self-inflicted gunshot, Plumlee got spooked. He claimed that no way would Haught have taken his own life. Vern was in a relationship with Diane Von On, and the two took off north. They went to Spanaway, Washington that December to stay at a commune. Spanaway is a farming community near McChord Air Force Base, near Tacoma. Months later in 1970, Plumlee and another man were arrested in Spanaway. That September, Vern and Robert Eugene Russell met some people drinking at a bar down in Long Beach, California, went to their house, started stealing stuff, and got caught, and a fight commenced. Plumlee and Russell stabbed two of the men and then fled to Washington. They were arrested for assault, attempted murder, theft, and the Dyer Act, taking a stolen car over state lines. Vern served 7 years for his role in the attempted murders, plus time in the brig for desertion of duty. After his parole, he worked as a welder, married, and had children. As of this writing, Plumlee is alive and living in the San Bernardino area of California. Now we know next to nothing about this next family member, so I'll keep this short and sweet. Kenneth Richard Brown was born April 12, 1952, in Ohio. He may have also lived in New York and Las Vegas before he and John Phillip Haught showed up at Spawn Ranch in mid-August 1969. Haught, aka Zero, and Brown helped transform stolen dune buggies for the family. During the October raid in Death Valley, Brown was arrested under the name Robert Ivan Lane, aka Soup Spoon. He also apparently used the name Scott Bell Davis or Scotty Davis. Brown, aka Lane, aka Davis, was one of the suspects in the autumn 1969 arson in Death Valley, but by the time those charges were issued, he was gone and not named. We may, in fact, not know his real name, although I did find a marriage record for a Kenneth Richard Brown born around 1952. But if he was friends with Zero Haught, he wasn't at the Venice Beach house when Haught died. And it is believed that as of 2024, Brown, or whoever he was, is now deceased. And now we come to the fourth of our lost boys of the Manson family, the one who was truly lost forever. John Phillip Haught was born April 20th, 1947. He later lived in Ohio. He joined the Navy as a seaman apprentice and served in Vietnam before his honorable discharge. He and Kenneth Brown, Scotty Davis, showed up at Spawn Ranch around the third week of August 1969. Both men were good mechanics who helped the family convert VW bugs into dune buggies. Later, some of those dune buggies were sold for cash. There are rumors that Haught may have had an association with the Straight Satans, but we don't know for certain how he was introduced to the family or exactly when he arrived. Haught joined Vern Plumlee and Bill Van Sickle in their crime spree that summer, breaking and entering, robbing, and holding up gas stations. During one of those robberies, events were triggered that led to the murder of Spawn Ranch hand Donald Shea on August 26th. Arrested during the Death Valley raid in October, Haught gave his true name. Shortly thereafter, during questioning of family member Kitty Ludesinger, she implicated Haught, Manson, Catherine Gypsy Scher, Diane Snake Lake, and Ruth Ann Oish Morehouse as the arsonists. She also mentioned a grease gun they took from the torched equipment, later identified among the possessions confiscated at Barker Ranch. Ludisinger's statements also implicated Susan Atkins in the July 1969 stabbing of musician Gary Hinman, and Atkins was taken to Los Angeles and booked on suspicion of murder. Just a couple weeks later, on November 5th, police were called to a house on Venice Beach rented by Mark Ross, an ex-Marine and character actor who allowed several members of the Manson family to stay in his rented home. Police were dispatched following reports of gunshots, and upon arrival at 28 Clubhouse Avenue, discovered John Phillip Haught in bed, deceased. The subject was found lying on a mattress with a .22 revolver and its holster beside him. The story was that Haught was in bed with little Patty, true name Patricia Baldwin, when he decided to play a game of Russian roulette. Russian roulette is typically played with one bullet in the 6-round chamber, thereby giving the odds of 94-6 of living. Instead, the revolver Zero shot himself with held a round in every chamber. His odds of death were 100%. He spun, fired at his right temple at point-blank range, and died. When police arrived, they not only found Zero deceased, but also the weapon had been wiped clean of prints. Nonetheless, they did pick up a partial print which belonged to Bruce Davis, one of the occupants of the house. Upon questioning, little Patty told them that Zero, who was alone in the room with her, said, "Oh, look, a gun. It has one bullet in it," before he spun, pointed, and shot. Little Patty also told police that the family often played Russian roulette, and that she felt Zero believed there was only one bullet in the revolver. Despite the suspicious circumstances of his death and the compromised evidence, police ruled this a self-inflicted accidental death. Some months later, a person who asked to remain anonymous told a Los Angeles Times writer that he witnessed Zero's shooting, and it wasn't self-inflicted, but at the hands of one of the women on the scene. That man has never been identified.
Zero was survived by his mother and sisters.
They have never spoken publicly about his life or his death. Bruce Davis is serving a life sentence for his involvement in the Shea and Hinman murders. Little Patty left California and lives back east. Police have declined past requests to open an inquest into the death of John Phillip Haught. The young men of the Manson family were a reflection of a generation left adrift. While the counterculture promised liberation, for these men, it delivered disillusionment and even death. They were the lost boys of the late 60s, caught between the violence of their pasts and the empty promises of a freewheeling future. They weren't searching for peace. They were searching for power, purpose, and a sense of belonging. Manson's family gave them all three, but at an unimaginable cost. In many ways, these men were victims of their time. They were raised in a society grappling with the aftershocks of World War II, thrust into the chaos of Vietnam, and left to navigate a culture that celebrated freedom, but often ignored the structures that made freedom sustainable. The communal life Manson offered wasn't about harmony, it was about control, and the men, angry and impressionable, became cogs in his violent machine. The tragedy of the Manson family isn't just the lives they took or the chaos they spread, but the potential lost among its members. Many of these young men might have found redemption in another context. Instead, they became foot soldiers in a delusional war against the establishment, their identities consumed by Charlie's twisted vision. The lost boys of the Manson family serve as a chilling reminder of what happens when disillusionment festers unchecked. They were young men seeking meaning in a chaotic world and found it in the worst possible place. Their story is not just one of horror, but of a warning, a reflection of how easily alienation and anger can be weaponized by those who understand its power.